Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Hartensteiner Kohler. I'm an architect at Kirksey Architecture. In addition to, or I guess I want to say, thanks for spending your Saturday morning with us on our virtual this year Michael G. Meyers site tour. In addition to being on the Michael G. Meyers Committee, I'm also one of the walking tour docents with the Architecture Center's walking tour program. So the committee has asked me to put together a digital presentation this year of the a walking tour of the site and the surrounding area. I know kind of like with a lot of other things, we're bummed that it's all online this year, but the benefit of that is actually we get to cover more ground because we can cover it virtually. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I almost forgot to do that. Let's see. There we go. So really excited this year when we settled on a site for the Michael G. Meyers project this year. It's located in the heart of the Montrose neighborhood, which is also home to some really great examples of architecture in Houston. Excuse me. It's also conveniently, for me at least, around a lot of sites that are on our Montrose walking tour. So I'll be pulling mostly from that information. And it'll be a longer tour than we would typically do, like I mentioned, if we were just walking around the site. But we really wanted to focus on kind of exposing all of y'all to some really great architecture in Houston. If you do end up pursuing architecture school in the future, especially if you end up going to school in Houston, these are all buildings that are frequently referenced by architecture professors at the Houston universities. So having that exposure before you get to school is super beneficial. So with that, I'll kick it off just with a brief introduction of the neighborhood. As I mentioned, the site is in the heart of the Montrose neighborhood. And even though today we consider that really, you know, not necessarily downtown Houston, but really Houston, central Houston, when it was first developed by J.W. Linc at the turn of the 20th century, it was actually considered a suburb. So, transportation was a lot different back then. It was a lot harder to travel longer distances. So this was considered kind of what you would consider Katy today, you know, people living out here in their big stately homes and then traveling in town to work. The neighborhood is characterized by 4 large tree-lined boulevards, and those boulevards were where the more stately homes were located, and then they were connected to, Houston proper by a streetcar system that would take people who lived in the suburbs into town. So instead of covering, Montrose is much bigger, we're going to focus on the area shown in the white box, if you can see my cursor here. And these white dots here represent all the buildings we're going to stop at virtually. And then you can see here, this large plot of land is where our site is. We have it broken into 3 smaller sites for y'all to choose from for your project. To start, we're going to start with the Montrose Campus, or the Menil Campus, which is located directly to the north of our site, these collection of dots here. The Menil Campus, so here we'll stop at 4 buildings on the Menil Campus. The Menil Collection here, the Rothko Chapel, the Scitumli Museum, and then the newest building, the Drawing Institute, which is directly to the north of our project site, actually. The Menil Collection and then eventually the Menil Campus began from the personal art collection of the couple you see in the picture on the left, John and Dominique de Menil. The de Menils were originally from France, and they moved here to Houston in 1941 due to World War II. Dominique was an heiress whose father, Conrad Schlumberger, started the Schlumberger Company. You see that's a name that you'll see on several buildings around Houston. They're connected to the petroleum industry, which, as most of us know, is really prevalent here in the Houston area. And they chose Houston because of that family connection to the city. Their art collection started just with, like most things, with 1 piece of art. John was on a business trip to New York, and he purchased a painting by Cezanne for $300. So it really just started with 1 piece. And then they had always had a passion for art and sharing art and the importance of, and understood the importance of art in culture and life. So they really quickly began collecting massive amounts of art. They were actually known for going to galleries of artists that they like and just buying the entire gallery to add to their collection. And then in addition to being collectors of art, they were also really passionate about sharing art. They wanted to share it with the people, especially the people of Houston, which had been their home. They were very big in the kind of the social scene of Houston, hosted a lot of dinner parties and such. And so they wanted to give back to the city that they had called home. The tour will be a little jumping through timelines, so we'll be going back and forth a little bit, but eventually in 1970, they eventually got this idea of creating a house for their art collection, a house that could be accessed by the public to show off their collection. They didn't want to just keep it in their home. But before they really could make any concrete plans, John de Menil passed away in 1973. And before any kind of action happened on that. But Dominique never lost that passion for wanting to share her art. So 10 years later, she hired Italian architect Renzo Piano to design that public house for her art, for their art collection. It was, she wanted to continue that memory of her and John and that passion for sharing art. So they hired Renzo Piano, and in 1987, the Menil Collection, which is this building here to the right, opened to the public. When hiring Renzo Piano, Mrs. de Menil gave Piano 2 critical design requirements that he must follow with his museum. That was that her art, she wanted it to be seen in natural daylight, and that the existing building should fit within the context of the site. So if you know anything about art, you know that like most things, it's best seen in natural light, but struggling with that is that the UV rays from the sun can damage art, you know, similar to like if we went to go sit out in the sun without sunscreen, we would eventually get sunburn. Similar things can happen to art. So it was a kind of a hard design requirement for Renzo Piano, because he kind of had to battle these 2 things. So the first design requirement we're going to talk about is that seeing that art in natural light. And to accommodate that, Renzo Piano really spent a lot of time studying the light in Houston. As I mentioned, he is an Italian architect, and the sun is not the same, or doesn't affect cities in the same way in different parts of the country. So he really had to study how light worked in Houston to be able to accommodate Dominique's request that her art be seen in natural daylight. And the way he achieved this was, this is a snapshot from a book I own. Renzo Piano is actually my favorite architect, so I own a lot of books about his architecture. He built this contraption here, and he was able to move the arm to study the building. There's a little model of the building here at different times of the year, different times of the day, and mimic that, how the light would work. And the resulting strategy to accommodate Dominique's request was this Baffle System, which became a really characteristic part of the Menil collection, the building itself. And the way it works, it's several layers. You can kind of peek through the window here of one of these inner courtyards. This is a picture of the inside of one of the galleries. And it's several components that hold together these big baffles, or a lot of people will say they look like leaves, so they call them leaves. And these lines here represent the angles of the sun. So you can see that when the sun first hits the baffle, instead of hitting the art directly, it hits a side of the baffle, and then it bounces off the side of the baffle to then wash over the art. So by doing this, the UV rays don't directly hit the art, therefore protecting it, but then you still get the natural light into the space. And you can see from this gallery here, there are some artificial lights here on the track you can see at the top, but really most of the space is lit by daylight. And that's also helped by, there's a few courtyards in the middle of the museum that help then filter light in. And then here is a shot from the exterior. You can see they also become a porch-like element that wrap around the museum. Moving from the exterior to the interior. And then here is another close shot of this baffle system. Renzo Piano is really known for working with light, and we'll see another example later on of the Scitumli, of how he created a similar solution for another museum as part of the Menil Campus. So that was how Renzo Piano resolved the light requirement. But moving to the requirement to fit within the context of the site, Montrose, although there's large stately homes along the grand boulevards, most of the neighborhood also has very small bungalows, little wooden bungalows, like the one you see here at the bottom of the picture. And there's actually bungalows along the north side of the Menil Collection and the south side. And so she didn't want a museum that looked like basically a spaceship dropped it down from space. She wanted it to feel like it had always been there, that it grew out of the site. And so to accomplish this, Renzo Piano really played with the volume of the museum. So you can see here, the sketch is a little, are not quite, it didn't quite scan right. So the ground doesn't actually slope up this drastically. It's pretty much a flat site. But this is the Menil Collection here. And you can see in relation to the bungalow across the street, it really doesn't feel much taller. It's mostly a one-story volume that then pops up in the back. All the galleries are here in the front portion. And then the back portion is administrative offices, and then also art storage up on the second floor. And then it's surrounded by this large porch. So it's really a long, linear, low building that fits well within the context of these small bungalows. And the Menil Foundation eventually ended up purchasing and restoring most of the bungalows that are to the north and the south of the building, and they house various offices for the Menil Collection. In addition to the volumetric or the massing of the building fitting within the character, he also used the materiality to fit within the character. So the gray material that you see on the side of the building, those are actually gray painted cedar planks. And they're meant to mimic the wood siding that was typical on the bungalows, so that even the material of the building fit within the context of the site. And then around the building, I'm gonna go back up to an aerial shot of it. There's a large park right next to the Menil Collection, which is part of the campus. And so this place is very active on the weekends. A lot of people come here for picnics and playing Frisbee with their dog and such. And so it really acts as an amenity to the neighborhood. Again, going back to that idea of giving a public, a gift to the city of Houston that everyone can enjoy. So from there, we're gonna move just to the other side of the park and talk about the Rothko Chapel, which again is also part of the Menil Campus. In 1964, the Menils, so this is much earlier than when the Menil Collection, the museum that we just looked at, was built. They commissioned Mark Rothko, who's an American painter, to paint 14 murals to be housed in a universal spiritual and meditative chapel. This is Mark Rothko here, and just a couple of pictures of his paintings. His art is very distinctive. I'm not an art enthusiast, so I'm not going to try to describe what his art is, but he's one of the few artists that when I see his work, I can recognize that, oh, that must be a Mark Rothko painting. And originally, the chapel was actually meant to sit on this, to be the university chapel for the University of St. Thomas. The Menils were, in addition to being art enthusiasts, that were also devout Catholics. So they were critical to the founding of the University of St. Thomas, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And when they hired or commissioned Mark Rothko to create these paintings, they also hired architect Philip Johnson to be the architect of the chapel. He had just finished designing their house, so he was kind of the personal favorite architect of the de Menils at the time. Even though he was the architect, Philip Johnson, Mark Rothko being the artist, he had full creative license on the space, so it was really whatever he wanted was, gold, because the building was going to be designed to specifically house his art. The chapel, or the creation of it, had a lot of issues from the very get-go. So first of all, The Basilian Fathers, who run the University of St. Thomas, when they saw the art, they wanted nothing to do with it. They didn't want it in a chapel. They didn't want it on their campus. They just really didn't like it, which ended up leading to a falling out with the de Menil. So from that point forward, the family didn't really have a connection to the University of St. Thomas. And then additionally, Mark Rothko really did not get along with Philip Johnson. So you can think of a lot of creatives and artists sometimes, well, a lot of times have egos, and they want their creative idea to be the one that wins. And so when you have two kind of heavy hitters there, a well-known artist and a well-known architect who's also well-known for his ego, they didn't really see eye to eye. So those two issues kind of compounding on each other led to the chapel kind of bouncing around. But several iterations later, the chapel was finally opened in 1971 on a different site, a site that's, again, part of the Menil Campus. Unfortunately, Mark Rothko never lived to see the completion of the chapel. He unfortunately passed away in 1971, or excuse me, 1970. So he never did get to see the finish of the chapel. So on the left here, we have an architectural model of the chapel. And then on the right is a picture of the chapel itself. So the building itself is shaped as an irregular octagon with a large skylight on the top. That's what this thing is here. And the outside is just a very nondescript red brick. You probably wouldn't think of it as a chapel when you first saw it. And that's really what, I have an inside shot on the next slide. And it's really what makes the impact of walking inside that much more impactful. Outside the chapel is a large reflecting pool. Think of like the reflecting pool at the National Mall, that same kind of idea. And inside that reflecting pool is a large sculpture called the Broken Obelisk. It was a piece of art by Barnett Newman, and it's dedicated to the memory of Martin Luther King Jr. It originally sat in Washington, D.C., and then the de Menils gifted it to the city of Houston. I think they originally wanted it to sit at City Hall, but the city of Houston didn't quite agree to that idea, so then they moved it here to be at the Rothko Chapel. And as I mentioned when I was talking about Rothko's paintings, the chapel itself is meant to be kind of a universal meditative space. It's not dedicated to a specific religion or school of belief. It's also meant to, or the mission is to encourage dialogue amongst different people. So they do host a lot of symposiums and lectures, obviously when there's not a pandemic going on. And that, again, spoke to the Menil's belief about, they had, in addition to art, they were really passionate about equality and social justice and those sort of things. Moving inside, this is what the inside of the chapel looks like. So here on the walls in kind of a purplish, blackish hue are Mark Rothko's paintings. And the inside is just a big open space with some benches. And as I mentioned, it's more of a meditative space. So sometimes you go in there and people are sitting, sometimes they have religious books from various religions outside. So you could grab one, and if you wanted to read, you could go in and read. A lot of people, when it's their first time in, they don't get the point of it, or they are wondering what they're supposed to see in the art. Like, if I stare at it long enough, will I see something? Will something jump out at me? But it's really just meant to be a meditative space. Most recently, it went through a major renovation. There was some issues with the building. They built a dedicated visitor center, but perhaps the biggest thing is they renovated this large skylight at the top. So the picture here on the bottom right is actually what it used to look like. The last time I was there, that's what it looked like. And it had this giant baffle over the skylight, which really wasn't the architect's intent originally. But as I mentioned, this was built in the early 70s, and technology with glazing wasn't quite there yet. So going back to what I mentioned with the Menil Collection and UV rays and art, you know, UV rays can damage art. They didn't have a way to have this large skylight without damaging Mark Rothko's paintings. So they had to put this large baffle over the skylight, which would wash light down. So now with technology being what it is, they were able to restore the skylight to what its original intent was. And I imagine it's a very different looking space. I'm actually quite interested to go visit it now that it has the skylight fixed. So now we're going to move just virtually walk around the corner and walk to the building directly behind the Menil Collection. This is the Scitumli Pavilion. This is Scitumli here. I'd never seen a picture of him before I put this together, and I think he looks like a happy grandpa, which is quite sweet. In 1995, the Dominique de Menil again hired Renzo Piano to design a museum dedicated to Scitumli's work. Scitumli is a American painter, sculptor, and photographer, and his art is predominantly large scale, freely scribbled, and almost graffiti-like. So this is actually a piece that's at the Scitumli in one of the larger gallery spaces. Again, he has a very distinctive style. Going back to the Menil Campus, this is less than 10 years after the Menil Collection itself was built. So you can see it has even though it's different in terms of materiality, it still has the same feel. It's a low building that, again, fit within the context of the site and the museum. It doesn't have the same wood cedar siding, but it still has that gray color, so fits within the color scheme of the Menil Collection. And so thinking about where this sits in relation to the Menil Collection, right here would be where the road is between the two, the Menil Collection being over here. So you actually walk to the side of the building, the door isn't on the front of the building, and you walk to the side to enter the museum. The museum itself is organized as a 9-square grid with the interior layout feeling more like a house than a museum. So it has, other than this one large gallery, which is the one Scitumli was standing in the first picture, it's a series of smaller rooms that you kind of meander through. And with it being a smaller scale museum, even in the Menil Collection, it does feel very house-like, like you're just walking through someone's house. And also similar to the Menil Collection, Renzo Piano came up with a creative solution to deal with the light in the space. So it's a different solution. He didn't use the light baffles like he did at the Menil Collection, but still this layered approach. So this is an exploded axonometric drawing of what all of that roof structure works. So it's essentially a skylight with a series of baffles that filter the light. And then on the inside of the gallery here, there's actually a piece of fabric that then further diffuses the light. So instead of having, like if you were in a building and they had lay-in tile, instead of that, it's actually a fabric here. And so the result is this really even diffused light that washes the space. The most interesting thing here is if you go into this room, on the other side of this walkway, there's a series of paintings that look like you're looking, that feel like you're looking out of windows into a forest. They line 3 of the 4 walls. And if the light is just right, the entire room actually feels like it's green. And it has nothing to do with green light bulbs and the light fixtures. It's just the way that the light plays with the work. So it's an interesting way of light adding to how the art is viewed. And then the last building that we're going to talk about on the Menil Campus is the one that's across the street from our site here. So just to give you some perspective, I believe this is the site option A on this corner, and then site option B is on this corner. And then directly across the street from that is the Drawing Institute, which was opened just recently in 2018, 2019. And it was designed by Johnston Mark Lee, which is a firm out of Los Angeles. The Drawing Institute itself was established in 2008 as and it's dedicated to the acquisition, exhibition, study, conservation, and storage of modern and contemporary art. I had to write that down because that was a lot of missions. And as it started as a traveling exhibit, and as the collection grew, the museum's foundation decided that they had a great opportunity as they were working on a master plan of their campus to create a dedicated building for that collection. And interesting enough, it's actually the only building in the US that's dedicated to modern and contemporary drawings. When you see the building itself, it looks very different than Renzo Piano's work on the Menil Campus. But if you look at it enough, it actually, or if you look at the pieces themselves, you can actually see a lot of similarities in how the building was thought up. thought of. So the building itself is composed of 3 enclosed volumes, clad in gray cedar, just like the Menil Collection is. And they're each dedicated to a specific thing. So there's one for study, one for exhibitions, and one for administrative offices. And they're all clustered under this one large plate metal roof that's white. And although it may look different, as I mentioned, than Renzo Piano's work, the Menil Collection, the Scitumli, it still has the same kind of volumetric approach. So it's a long, low, linear building that doesn't really, even though it's more contemporary interpretation of the neighborhood character, it still feels like it fits within the neighborhood. You can almost think of this angular roof being like an inverted gabled roof, like you would see like your typical pitched roof that the bungalows would have. It also, the large overhangs of the roof structure here, along with all the trees that are in the courtyard and around the building, they help to minimize the amount of light that goes into the building, while still allowing some natural daylight to go in and light the spaces. So with that, we're going to leave the Menil campus and move right next door to the University of St. Thomas. They're pretty much neighbors, or they are neighbors. And so, as I mentioned, the John and Dominique de Menil were devout Catholics, and when the Basilian Fathers of Ontario, that's a Catholic order, came to Houston and wanted to start a university, they were involved in the planning and execution of that. The first building on the campus that we're going to talk about is this group of buildings actually here. And that is the main quad on the university's campus. And it was built by Philip Johnson in 1958-59. So again, this was around the time that the de Menils had Philip Johnson build their house. So they recommended him to design the academic quad for the new university. Philip Johnson, he's a notable architect and has quite a bit of work in Houston. He was the favorite architect of a developer that developed a lot of downtown, Gerald D. Hines, who recently passed away last year. And so a lot of Hines's buildings, especially downtown, were designed by Philip Johnson. This is Philip Johnson himself. And behind him, you might recognize these buildings in downtown. Pennzoil Place, which he designed, and then also the Bank of America Center, which sit right across the street from each other. And then I had a very personal connection to Philip Johnson because he actually designed the Gerald D. Hines College of Architecture and Design, which I spent 5 long years at when I went to architecture school. So again, being that he had a connection to Gerald D. Hines, when Hines decided to donate the money to the university to build a new architecture building, he naturally selected Philip Johnson to be that architect. So when designing the quad for University of St. Thomas, he looked to Thomas Jefferson's design of the academic village at the University of Virginia, which is an example of a neoclassical academic quad. The idea of a quad in campus planning is not new, and it's on a lot of universities. Rice has several quads, U of H has quads, and this is the example. This is the UVA quad. So much more traditional looking buildings, but essentially a quad is a center courtyard that's surrounded by buildings, and here is that plan of it. So he was inspired by this, but wanted to do a modernist interpretation. Philip Johnson at this time was considered a modern architect. He followed the less is more, form follows functions, and kind of skin and bones only philosophy of design, typical of a lot of the modern architects at the time. So he took this idea and then gave it a modern approach. So this is, again, the UVA academic village on the left, and then an aerial shot of the main quad at the University of St. Thomas. So you can already see the difference in that instead of these big stately looking buildings, they're very low rectilinear buildings with with flat roofs instead of all the pitched roofs. So again, a modernist interpretation of that. And interesting enough, at the time of when Philip Johnson first designed the quad, because the university was new, they didn't have a lot of the land. They didn't have all the land that their campus now sits on. So he was only really responsible for the first 3 buildings over here. And then over time, as the campus grew and as the need for new buildings grew, other architects stuck to his master plan and completed the rest of the quad. I didn't have a ton of pictures of the actual quad itself, but you can kind of get a sense of that, again, that modernist interpretation, less is more. Whereas the UVA would have really ornate columns holding all this canopy up. Philip Johnson just has black painted steel columns. They almost feel like sticks, just barely holding up the breezeway here. Sitting at one end of this quad is the second building we'll talk about, which is the Chapel of St. Basil, right here. It was also designed by Philip Johnson along with Ritchie and Fiore and Merriam Holt Architects in 1997. So thinking back to when Philip Johnson first designed the quad, this is about 40 years later. That's quite a bit of time, which you might think, oh my gosh, it looks so much different than the rest of the quad. And that 40 years really explains that. So first starting with where it's located, the interesting thing is that it's located directly on the opposite side of the quad from the library. You can actually see that in the little pin from Google Earth. And that is said to represent the dialogue between faith and reason. Again, this is a Catholic university, so it's dedicated to the pursuit of education, but then it's also, of course, dedicated to a religious faith. So that duality of faith and reason represented here on either side of the quad. And again, I mentioned this was completed about 40 years after Philip Johnson started the quad. And by this time he had transitioned from being a modern architect to being a postmodern architect. And that really explains the sharp contrast in the look and feel of the building. I still and always have kind of struggled with how to describe postmodern architecture, but I think the easiest thing is just to give you another example of postmodern. It was really, as a style, is defined as a reaction against the rigidness and lack of ornament in modern architecture. So whereas the modern quad was, no ornament, just windows and steel, only really what it needed. Postmodern architecture was about adding some of that ornament and art back into the facade. It usually characterized as being a little quirky. This is another great example of postmodern architecture, which some of you may recognize. This is the Federal Reserve Bank of Houston along Allen Parkway, just outside of downtown. It was designed by Michael Graves, which is another notable postmodern architect. And some examples of that kind of quirkiness in this building is that are easy to illustrate is it's mostly a brick building, and some of you may have houses that are built out of brick, so you kind of know what a brick looks like. You can hold one in your hand. They're not very big, but what they did here is they actually exploded the patterning of brick using 2 different brick colors to use bricks to create a brick pattern, which is way out of scale from what a brick size would actually be. Also, these columns here in the openings, they almost look, too small to really be holding that up. Like they're, you'd almost be nervous to walk under this, in this balcony, knowing that only these little twigs basically are holding it up. So those are some just characteristics of the postmodern here. The University of Houston's College of Architecture that I showed earlier, that's another example of Philip Johnson in his postmodern stage of his career. Going back to the chapel though, it's created by consists of 3 geometric shapes that engage each other. So the white cube here is the actual chapel itself. And then there's a gold dome and then this large black granite plane. And that granite plane intersects all 3 pieces. So I can go back to this aerial here. You can see kind of this really great detailing of how this plane intersects the dome here. And as I mentioned earlier when talking about the Rothko Chapel is actually meant to sit here, but instead it later became this St. Basil Chapel. And then here is just some detail shots. One of that entry, to enter the chapel, you walk through this almost like a tent flap opening, and then there's doors on the other side. And then this here is just an interior shot of the chapel itself. Sticking with the chapel theme, we'll move into our third chapel that we'll talk about today. We're moving just to the other side of the University of St. Thomas campus, but to the Byzantine Fresco Chapel, which is actually part of the Menil Campus, kind of a blend between the two. And again, it's not directly next to our Michael G. Meyers site, but just on the other side, there's a group of those bungalows that I mentioned that are indicative of the Montrose neighborhood. It's just on the other side of those, or right here, thereabouts. The Byzantine Fresco Chapel, it was designed by Francois de Menil in 1997. That was actually John and Dominique's son. He became an architect. And the chapel was designed to house 13th century frescoes from a small chapel in Linc Li, Cyprus that were looted in the 1980s. So Cyprus here is in the Mediterranean, just south of Turkey. So these were historic frescoes that were stolen out of this chapel. And due to Dominique's connection to the art collecting world, she heard that they were being sold in New York, I believe it was. And so she partnered with the Church of Cyprus, the Orthodox Church there, to purchase the frescoes and restore them. And in return, the Church of Cyprus agreed to loan them to the Manila Collection to be on display here in Houston. So the building, again, was designed specifically to house these frescoes. Similar to the Rothko Chapel, you walking up to this building, you'd have no idea what it is. It doesn't really look like what we would might necessarily consider a chapel to look like. It almost looks fortress-like. So it's got these concrete panels here that are big in scale. It's not a big building, but it feels heavy and like you would need, I don't know, like a really thick jackhammer to get through one of these walls if you were trying to break in. And then similar to the Rothko Chapel, the look on the outside really makes when you walk in the door that much more, I guess, impactful. So moving inside the space, this is what the inside looked like. It doesn't look like this, unfortunately, anymore. But one of Dominique's requirements to her son when he was designing the building is that she wanted the frescoes to be seen in the same relationship as they would be seen in that church in Cyprus. So she wanted the two frescoes that she saved. It was the fresco that was in the dome of the church, and then the fresco that was in what we call the apse of the church. So right here behind the altar space. And she wanted those to be in the same relationship. So within that fortress-like building, Francois created a chapel within the space. And these panels are made of translucent glass and held up by steel rods, giving it kind of a light and ethereal look. I found a great model on his website, actually, that shows a section model that cuts through that fortress-like exterior and then shows the small chapel on the inside, which I think really illustrates kind of this light, airy, it looks like, it feels like everything, or it is, you know, all these pieces are basically suspended from the ceiling and then float there. And then the chapel itself was actually a consecrated chapel, so it did function as a religious space. In 2014, the frescoes were returned to the Church of Cyprus. The loan period had ended, and so the building then transitioned to be a house of site-specific artist installations that are commissioned by the Menil Foundation. So two of those examples are the Infinity Machine, that was the first one there, and then another one is the Fabiola project, which I actually did get to go see, and that was quite an interesting exhibit. So with that, we're going to move away from all the chapels and art museums that we have been looking at. And I have two examples of some residential architecture that's in the Montrose neighborhood. The first is actually still part of the, or nowadays part of the St. Thomas campus. It's this house here on one of these grand boulevards. So you can see that boulevard here. And it is the Linc Li House. It was built by Sanguinet, Stats, and Barnes in 1912. And it was built by the gentleman who developed Montrose as a neighborhood, James Wiley Linc. And he built it as a model of what the big stately homes on one of his boulevards could be. So you think of, you know, when you go to the suburbs and look at a model home today, that was essentially what he was doing. He wanted it to set the example of what his expectations were. In 1912, when it was built, it cost $60,000 to build, which sounds like not a lot of money today, but back then, you think about inflation and all that, it today equates to about $1.6 million, which was unheard of at the time. Houses, just people didn't spend that much money on houses. And it was designed to exude exuberance and wealth. It has lots of ornamentation and rich materials. Compare that against the St. Thomas quad that we looked at a little bit earlier, you know, very different in terms of every little thing is detailed. It has these very ornate doors that you walk through. And adding to that too is also it sits up on a hill. So as they were excavating the boulevards out, they took that spoils, as we call it, that soil, and built up a little mound, or not a little mound, but a big mound for the house to sit on. So not only is it looks rich and wealthy, it also kind of sits above you on this little hill. And then here's a great picture I found, an older photo, which it's because it's on the university's campus, there is, you know, it's not super dense around it, but this is still much more wide open than it is today. The Lincs eventually sold the house to Thomas P. Lee, which is where the Lee comes into the Linc Li House in 1916, which is just a short time after it was built. I feel like you wouldn't have really gotten to enjoy the house if you only lived there for 4 years. But they sold it for $90,000, which is the highest price ever paid for a house in Houston at the time. So again, if $60,000 in 1912 was $1.6 million today, that's even more than that then. And then in 1946, Mrs. Lee sold the house to the Basilian Fathers to become the first building of the new St. Thomas University campus. So the house at one point, it was actually where the president of the university lived. I think today it houses some administrative offices and then also as an event space for the university. And then the last house we're going to talk about, and the last stop before we dive into the actual site itself, which I know y'all are all interested to see, is the Howard Hughes house, just south of the Linc Li House here, still close to the University of St. Thomas campus. And it was designed by William Ward Watkin in 1918. Watkin was a architecture professor and notable Houston architect. I believe he taught at Rice. And so if you actually go on our shameless plug for the rest of our walking tours, if you go on the Rice tour, you see a lot of his buildings. He contributed a lot to the Rice campus. The house itself, has a red brick exterior with white multi-pane windows and a white trim around the door, which is key characteristics of the Georgian or federal style. Think like really old buildings in Massachusetts, you know, the early colonies, that kind of look. Also really flat facade. So if you compare it to the Linc Li House, that one had big overhangs and balconies, whereas this one doesn't have any of that. It's quite flat. It was also designed, it's basically long and narrow with connections from either side to the outside. And it was designed like that to accommodate airflow within the house, because again, in 1918, there really wasn't any air conditioning. So hot Houston summers, to keep people cool inside their houses, they needed the design of the house to encourage airflow throughout the house. The house, other than being a great example of these grand stately Montrose houses, is most famously known for being the childhood home of Howard Hughes, which may or may not be someone you've heard of before. He's very famous Houstonian. He was an American business magnate, investor, record-setting pilot, engineer, and film director. So he was, I don't think the phrase jack of all trades really fits, to think that he could, you know, direct and produce some really famous films, but then also like set plane or pilot flight speed records and design airplanes. Those just seem like very different pursuits, but he kind of did it all. And this was his childhood home. This is where he grew up. So that's him there, Howard Hughes with one of his planes. You might also know him more for who Leonardo DiCaprio played in the movie The Aviator, which came out, I guess, I want to say a couple years ago, but that it's actually been longer than that. So might age me a bit, but so it was quite eccentric, interesting character. If you don't know him for being a business magnate or the movie The Aviator, being a pilot, his estate eventually led to the creation of the Howard Hughes Corporation, which ultimately developed the Woodlands. So you might know him more from that connection there. They also recently developed Bridgeland, which is another master plan community out in, I guess, the Cypress area. So with that ends kind of the maybe long-winded tour around the surroundings of our site, but we really wanted to dive into some of that great architecture that I mentioned. I'd encourage all of y'all to, if you can or have the opportunity, to actually come down here and take a look at some of these buildings in person. The Menil Campus is actually free to the public, so you can access all of those buildings for free. During the pandemic, they just asked that you make reservations online so they can monitor capacity. But again, that aligns with Dominique and John's mission of wanting, our passion of sharing that art to the Houston public. There's never any admission to enter any of the museums. And then of course, the university campus, you're free to just walk around. You could actually, it's quite easy to just park up here's the parking lot for the Menil campus, and you can easily see all of the buildings within a nice Saturday afternoon, just walking around the site. With that, we're going to move to talking through our proposed Michael G. Meyers site. So this is the drawing that all of y'all should have gotten with the program. This is the site here, and then we've broken it into 3 smaller sites. So site A at the corner of West Main and Loretto, site B off of West Main and somewhat of Yupon, and then site C along Richmond Avenue. And when I started more of the contextual tour, I mentioned that it has a great relationships to some of the buildings that I talked about. So again, those are just to the other side of West Main is the Drawing Institute here, which we talked about. Building 2, we didn't talk about it, but it's also a part of the Menil Campus. It's the Richmond Hall. I believe it was an old grocery store, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe, I can't remember. It's been a while since I've been in architectural history. But today, currently, it's home to artist installation by Dan Flavin. He's a light artist, so kind of an interesting building there. And then again, building 3 is that Byzantine Fresco Chapel, just right up here. So with that, I have a couple of just screen grabs, but I also have Google Street View up. So I'm gonna let the rest of the committee jump in as they would like to talk about kind of the correct characteristics of the site, and also key elements that we hope that you all pay attention to. So starting with, this is a shot down Richmond Avenue, which is just south of the site here. Richmond is a quite busy street. You can see just by how wide it is. It's one of the main, it's not a freeway, but it's kind of a main thoroughfare through this part of town. This is the site here on the other side. It has all these great trees along the side of the site. And then on the other side of Richmond are several businesses. I think I have another grab farther down the street. Yep. Business, I believe there's a post office or something on the other side of this little street. And then you can also see there's a bus stop down Richmond as well. So an example of similar to Montrose, our the boulevards I mentioned that are kind of characteristic of the Montrose neighborhood. You have this nice wide median with these great older oak trees in the middle. And then flipping around, I think I went the wrong way. There we go. And then this here is that the corner, this is Richmond Hall here that I mentioned. So this is looking to the southwest corner of the site. So you can see the trees are much more dense along Richmond, but then kind of taper off as you turn down this side straight, the Loretto Drive. And then here, jumping up the northwest corner, there again is the Drawing Institute here. This is a shot at Site A. And then this is much walking down essentially West Main Street, looking down at Site B. So the Drawing Institute would kind of be behind me off screen a little bit. Then you can see Richmond Hall in the background. And this is where there's a row of bungalows just adjacent to the site. Oops. That's the last street grab I have, but like I mentioned, I also have the Google Street View open up. So I'll let if Brian or if I think Mitzi, Ignacio, if any of y'all wanted me to walk down a certain way, and or if you want to add anything, just feel free to jump in.
Jennifer, was there something that, so part of the different sites that we had, Megan, can I share my site? Let me, or my screen, I mean, let me pull up something. Jennifer, could you send me that?
Yeah, it looks like what Megan shared is different from what we shared with the students.
Sorry about that, y'all.
The site map, which I can screen share what we shared with the students.
My apologies.
Where was the difference at?
Let me just share this. So this is what we gave the students.
Oh, okay.
So
yes.
It has A running on the left side and instead of along the bottom. So yes. It's just so this is what we're going with though, right?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So, sorry about that, y'all. But just to clarify, Megan was completely right in describing kind of all of the sides of the street that you guys just saw. But we had kind of changed Site A in what we presented to you guys, because if you notice all of the trees that Megan pointed out, we want you to kind of incorporate those into your project. It's not often that clear cutting is kind of the way to go with approaching a site. You obviously need to fit your building, but sometimes it's interesting to work around with what we have. The 3 different sites is for you guys to kind of think about how you are going to interact with the neighborhood. Like Megan showed in her really great and thorough presentation, there's a lot of different architectural elements that are really relevant to modern and contemporary architecture that you guys can reference. And so each site possesses a unique kind of challenge in how you integrate with the community and how you approach the street and how pedestrians will interact with your project as well. Richmond is quite a busy street, and so it gets a lot of access and it gets a lot of visibility, whereas Site A is a very long and linear site and has a lot of access to natural light and open space, as well as a kind of perpendicular connection to the Menil Campus. And Site B is kind of tucked away into this kind of more neighborhood function of the surrounding area. So you, as the kind of architect in this situation, are going to kind of choose what you think is going to best represent this area. And you can kind of learn some of the things that you've taken from this presentation to think about what's going to influence your project the most. Yes. So one of the teachers is asking if you guys can get some dimensions of these sites. We can send out a CAD file with just clear dimensions of these areas.
Are there any other questions that students, teachers that you all have? So as many of you saw, we are recording this. So I will post the presentation and send out the link to everybody. So students that were unable to make it will be able to view it, or if you all need to go back and reference something, it'll be available. Okay, doesn't seem like there's any questions. Oh wait, do we have, let me see. Okay. And I'm just gonna make one more note that on Saturday, March 27th will be our interim project review. And so this is an opportunity for you all to share kind of where you are in the process of designing your structure. You can come with as little, I mean, you should be coming with like sketches, with just ideas. It's just to walk through any sort of design problems or ideas that you might have to share with the committee. This will be a one-on-one a meeting. So you'll be meeting with one of the committee members for 10 to 15 minutes to share ideas. And then we'll probably be rotating through a couple of different committee members. So you'll get a perspective from different people in terms of your project and where you are, and suggestions that you can take and incorporate or not incorporate into your design. But I encourage you all to sign up. It's a great opportunity to get feedback from some professionals. I'm going to say thank you to Megan and Brian. Megan, that was a great presentation. And yeah, like Megan said, get out, go and see it. The Rothko Chapel is actually, they're celebrating 50 years. And at the Menil right now are paintings from Rothko, and they have a number of programs online. It's a wonderful, beautiful, even if you never walk into the buildings, it's just nice to be outside and enjoy the landscaping and just a sense of the campus. But yeah, get out there and walk around. And Architecture Center Houston has an app that you can download, and our Montrose tour is on there, so you can also use that as a guide to navigate the area. And all of the sites that Megan mentioned are on that app.
Yeah, and another shameless, or I guess recommendation or plug, like I mentioned at the very beginning, because these are such great examples of architecture in Houston, if you do end up pursuing architecture school, either in Texas or it's more specifically in Houston, they're constantly referenced by architecture professors. So if you want a little couple brownie points from future studio professors, if you say, oh, I've been there, or oh, I know who, like the building you're talking about, yeah, it's a great benefit to kind of be familiar with those buildings here in Houston.
Okay, well, thank you all, and have a great weekend. And we'll either see you on the 27th, or feel free to reach out to me or Ignacio with any questions that you might have.